Hello, history people. Welcome to the class for Thursday, April 9th. Before we start here, I should let you all know that tomorrow is Good Friday and Monday is Easter Monday. So those are holidays. And I know it might feel right now that every day is a holiday, depending on what your situation is here. But officially, Good Friday and Easter Monday are holidays, so there will be no class and no videos until Tuesday, right? So that is what's happening. We'll still have our reflection assignment next week. That will be nice and simple, so don't worry too much about that, right? But for now, well, let's go ahead and talk about our topic of the day, which is going to be about the Canadian economy. So let's get started here. So, Canada is not the most powerful country in the world, and we are about 10% of the size of the United States. We are a fairly rich country, right? We're in the G7, right? Which means that we're one of the top 7 economies in the world. But compared to the United States, we are quite small, right? And the United States, meanwhile, has the most powerful economy in the entire world currently, and we are their largest trading partner. And much of our economy is tied to theirs, right? The obvious reason for that is we're so close to them. So the Americans are big, 10 times as large as us in terms of population, and they're right over our border. And we, in Canada, don't have as much economic independence from them as you might first think. So, let's use an example to explain what I mean by that. So, cars, right? The auto industry. Canada has a really huge auto industry, right? 10% of our manufacturing GDP is in making cars. And we are the 9th biggest producer of cars in the world. But you might think, okay, we make a lot of cars. Is there a Canadian car? Let's think. Toyota, Nissan, and Suzuki, right? Those are Japanese cars. Ford and Chevrolet, right? Those are American cars. Kia is a Korean car, right? And, you can go down the list, right? Maserati is an Italian car, all of that sort of thing. Right? But there's no such thing as a Canadian car, right? And you might think, well, hang on. If we're the ninth biggest producer of cars in the world, how come there are no Canadian cars? Well, and the answer to that is the factories and the companies that are making cars here come from somewhere else. In 1964, our Prime Minister, John Diefenbaker, signed what's called the Auto Pact with the United States, which essentially meant that American companies would come here to build cars, right? To build their cars, I should say. Which meant a lot of jobs for Canadians, right? Working for companies like Ford or Chevrolet. And nowadays, Toyota and Nissan also have car factories here as well. But all of those cars are American cars or Japanese cars or whatever it may be. And there's no such thing as a Canadian car, right? So that's sort of the situation for a lot of our economy, right? Where we make things here, but often we're making them for companies that are from different countries, right? So Canada is the place where you might put a factory, for instance, but in terms of actually making the cars, right, or making whatever it is you need to make, right, it's all being done for a company that exists somewhere else. And you can look at all sorts of things in our economy that are like that, right? Think about the Canadian economy. Okay, let's think about where you go to shop, right? Back when you could go to shop, right? Obviously, you can't really do that right now because of COVID-19, but let's leave that aside. Okay, so, big example, Walmart, right? Probably you've gone to a Walmart to buy something or other. I certainly have. Walmart is American owned, right? And it has run many Canadian stores out of business, right? There's a couple of them. We used to have this place, Eaton's, right? Right now we have the Eaton Center, but this used to be our Walmart Eaton's. We also had a store called Zellers, right? There's Zellers, right? As you can see, store closing. We used to have all those big Canadian Walmart stores, but Walmart destroyed them, right? Walmart was able to run all of those stores out of business, right? Same thing happened with a store called Future Shop, right? Which is now replaced with Best Buy, right? So Canadian businesses all get run out of business, right, by the Americans. And you can think about the things you eat too. McDonald's, for instance, right, that giant fast food company, that's American. Burger King is American. Subway is American. Domino's is American, right? Pizza Hut's American. And this might shock some of you, what I'm about to say. Tim Hortons, also owned by an American, right? So that store, right, is supposed to be the big Canadian store where they serve that Canadian coffee and donuts and all that. I'm afraid it's owned by a Texan, right? Someone from America. So all of those stores are owned by Americans, right? Your clothing stores, right? If you ever go to buy your clothes at Gap or Old Navy. In fact, I think this shirt I'm wearing is from, I think this is from Old Navy. Those are owned by Americans, right? And usually the ones that aren't, right, are also owned by foreigners, right? So H&M, for instance, is owned by the Swedish, and Uniqlo is owned by the Japanese, for instance, right? So all of those stores are owned by someone outside of our country, right? We do have a Canadian television and movie industry, but it's pretty small, right? You can ask yourself, well, what was the last Canadian television show that you actually watched, right? It's a pretty small industry, and it mainly is limited to the CBC, right? We have the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, right, or CBC, right? That's where it's mainly limited to. But it's pretty small, right? And it's nothing compared to the big Hollywood movies, of course. Right? So, often when they film movies, right, if for Hollywood, the sets will be up here, right? Lots and lots of movies like, X-Men were filmed in Toronto, for instance, and plenty of movies get filmed in British Columbia, right? So it's very common for movies to be made here, right? But again, it's Americans coming here and shooting the film because it's cheaper to do it here, and then, of course, it's still an American movie, right? So a lot of things happen in Canada, but often the owner or the creator is often America. So, you might ask yourself, well, why is that? How come there aren't any Canadian businesses? So, in 1992, we signed an agreement called NAFTA, right? This would have been our Prime Minister of the time, Jean Chrétien, right? So this is an agreement with Canada, the United States, and Mexico to have what's called free trade, right? So free trade is when you can trade back and forth without any sort of tariff. So, a tariff is a tax you put onto a good coming into the country. So, if I were American and I wanted to sell a pencil in Canada, right? If there were a tariff, right, I might sell this pencil for like 10 cents in America, but in Canada, if there were a tariff, I would have to sell it for 15 cents, right? Because, I'm paying an extra tax. So what free trade does is it gets rid of the tariffs, right? So it makes it so that this pencil, it costs 10 cents in the United States, and it costs 10 cents over here, right? So that's one thing that free trade does, right? So, with no tariffs, though, it becomes very, very hard, right? Because the Americans are much bigger than us. So let's say I am Canadian and I have a business selling pencils, right? And then let's say this cat was from America and had a factory that makes 10 pencils for every one that I make, right? The cat's pencils are much cheaper than mine, right? Because the cat has so many more resources and so many more people, right? So just my small Canadian business, right? I can't make pencils in the same way that this American cat can, right? So what that means is that, he is going to sell 10 pencils for every one that I sell, right? And, when people go to the store to buy things, right, are they going to buy the pencil that costs $1 Canadian but was made in Canada? Or are they going to buy the 50-cent pack of pencils that costs 50 cents but it was made in America, right? So what that does is it means that the Americans run us out of business, right? And that's why you end up with all of these Canadian businesses being run out of town, right? Because they can't compete with the Americans, right? So you might think, well, hang on, why do free trade if it will run all the businesses out? That's a very good question, and let's answer it. So, what we get in return for free trade is cheaper stuff, right? If we had to make everything for ourselves here in Canada, then everything would be more expensive. So, if, for example, you were getting cat food that only could be made in Canada, then it could only be sold for what it costs to make in Canada, right? So, your cat food might cost $1 a can. Whereas if you get American cat food, it might cost 50 cents a can, right? So what Canadians get out of free trade are cheaper prices, right? It's much cheaper to bring this stuff in from America than it does to make it all here, right? So that's the trade that free trade gives us, right? So we're able to get cheaper stuff, right, in return for not being able to really have many of our own businesses, right? So for an average consumer, right, that can work out to be a good thing, right? Because you go to the grocery store, you're paying less. You go to buy, a smartphone, you're paying less, right? You're not paying for any tariffs, right? And that's good for you, right? When you go to buy things. Now, that's what Canada has been doing for a very long time. NAFTA was signed in 1992, right? And it's being changed right now to the USMCA by Donald Trump, but it's about the same thing, right? So Canada's been doing this for some time now. But, recent events might start to change this, actually, right? Because you might have been hearing on the news things about the N95 mask. Excuse me. N95 masks, which you see here, are the special masks that are made to protect nurses, doctors, surgeons, and other people in the front line of the medical crisis, the COVID-19 crisis. It's what protects them from getting the disease themselves. So these masks are extremely important, right? So we need to have those in order to protect our frontline nurses. And what you might have heard is there's a desperate struggle to get these masks right now because, well, the crisis is ongoing. All countries are trying to get as many as they can. But these masks are currently not really made in Canada, right? They're made in America, they're made in China, they're made elsewhere. Canada was not producing them in large numbers before, right? And the reason for that is because, well, we had free trade, right? We were just getting these things before from America, from China. In fact, there was a very big fight recently. The fight was where Donald Trump tried to stop the company 3M, which is an American company, from sending face masks to Canada, sending those N95 masks that we need to protect our frontline workers, right? So essentially Trump tried to steal a bunch of our masks, I believe 3 million in all, right? And there was a very big conflict about that, right? I believe that the masks are still being sent right now, but people are talking now about that because, well, now people are asking, well, hang on, why aren't we making those masks in Canada? Well, shouldn't we be doing that, right? Why can't we just, they're just, they're complicated, but they're cloth, right? It's not like they're made, they need to be made on the moon or something, right? Any country can make these, so why aren't we making them here? So right now in Ontario and in all of the country, there is a big rush to create factories so that we can get those masks made in Canada, right? So that's happening at this very moment, right? But the reason we're not right now, it's factories are being made, equipment's being prepared, and we're getting ready to make them here because we weren't doing it before, right? So oh, and by the way, as long as we can last till May, I think we'll be okay in that regard, right? Because we'll start making all of those things for ourselves, and we'll be much safer at that point, right? Not reliant on any foreign country or Trump or whatnot. But anyway, the reason I'm bringing this up is because we didn't have the capacity to make those masks because of free trade, right? So the way it worked before is, again, why make it in Canada when you can make it somewhere else? It'll be cheaper, and, that's all there is to it, right? So that's an issue that we see right now when it comes to free trade. So for the vast long time, we've had free trade in this country, but I do wonder, maybe after this is all over, people might start to turn against this and say, well, hang on, even if it's more expensive, maybe we should be making certain things here in Canada. Maybe we shouldn't have free trade for everything. So that's sort of an interesting thing that's coming out of this crisis. But again, to summarize this main thing about the Canadian economy, we make a trade here in Canada. We trade being able to have independent Canadian businesses for the ability to have cheaper goods and services from other countries, right? So that's the trade we make here, right? So when you buy a car, it is not a Canadian car, even if it was made in Canada, but it's still a lot cheaper than it would have been without it, right? So that's the trade we make, right? Whereas if we did do everything by ourselves and we did have Canadian cars or Canadian everything else, right, it would be more expensive, right? So that's the trade we make. So, what do you guys think? Is free trade good for Canada? Or do we need to start making more things in Canada and putting tariffs on outside goods, right? So send me your answers if you want to talk about what's going on with the masks. That would be interesting. And if you want to learn more about free trade, try reading your textbook, page 143 to 147, right? It'll tell you a little bit more about those trade agreements. Let me put that right here, right? So that's page 143 to 147, right? So if you're not still a bit confused about free trade and the way it works, feel free to read those pages and get back to me. One more question, by the way. Do you guys think these videos are working pretty well, right? It's been 4 days so far of doing online classes. Do you think these videos are good? Is there something I could be doing better? Should I use the cats more, or should I use them less? I don't want to use them less. There'll always be a cat appearance in my videos. But what do you think? Is there something that I could improve with the videos? If you think there is, just tell me, right? Because I'm pretty new at this too, and I would love to have your feedback, right? As always, you send your feedback to faisal.ahmed.tdsp.on.ca, right? And let me know what you think. So thanks so much for listening, guys, and I hope you're all safe. Have a very good Easter weekend. I will post a question and answer video tonight. Okay, take care.